This July, we're taking life seriously. Cardiac arrest is scary and more common than you might think. Did you know that every year nearly 9 million people will experience a cardiac event outside of hospital? Would you know what to do? I'm Australian actor Steve Bastoni, and I'm urging everyone to learn CPR as part of our Don't Die July campaign. Visit don'tdiejuly.com and sign up today, because you can't put a price on life.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Well, hello, and a very warm welcome back to the Muckrakers with me, Andrew Eborn. And here on the Muckrakers, we pledge to continue tackling the most pressing and controversial issues of our day, shining more light and less heat on the matters that really concern you. What I'm looking at today is going over to the US and what on earth is happening with the US presidential campaign. And it's more of a conversation than an interrogation of. I'm joined by my wonderful TNT co-hosts, James Freeman, looking wonderfully tanned, and Taylor Hudak. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Hello, Andrew.
Good to see you. Now, 2 days after surviving that appalling assassination attempt, an emotional Donald Trump appeared at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee with a bandage on his ear, and he was greeted by a crowd shouting "fight," the word he mouthed upon surviving the shooting. Earlier, Trump nominated his vice presidential pick, which was Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, which sounds like a cheap sportswear store, doesn't it? But he was formally nominated as the GOP ticket for the presidential 2024 ticket. Now, we've looked at sort of J.D. Vance, and he's made all sorts of interesting comments about Trump beforehand. I think said previously he wasn't a Trump fan. He himself is a venture capitalist turned Ohio senator. He rose to fame with his 2016 memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, I think it was, and he once described himself as a never-Trumper, calling the then candidate Donald Trump in 2016 an idiot, cultural heroine, and potential American Hitler. Horrendous language. What do you make of all of this, Taylor?
Yes, so we have so much news to cover now on the Republican side. And let me just say before I begin answering your question here, you know that Joe Biden has to be giving a huge sigh of relief that at least for this next week or two, perhaps the media is not so much focused on him and his mental capacities. But before I get into some of the policies or ideology of J.D. Vance, that is Trump's VP pick, I do want to talk about just briefly his history, his background. As you mentioned, Andrew, he does have quite an extraordinary life story that many would refer to as perhaps inspirational. So first of all, he's a very young man. He's only 39 years old. He will turn 40 in August. If Trump is elected in November, that would make J.D. Vance the third youngest vice president in United States history. And this is really interesting because it does really provide a contrast against Joe Biden, who is much older, 80 years old, who is also in a mental decline, and that has been much of the focus of the media the past few weeks. So you see a huge contrast here. Perhaps that also was a factor in former President Trump's decision to choose J.D. Vance, but he has a interesting background. After graduating high school, he enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, so he has experience in the military, which he says does shape some of his views on U.S. foreign policy. He graduated law school, in fact, from Yale Law School in 2013. He also has some connection to Peter Thiel, which we could get into. Some people are quite critical of this, and I think for a good reason. And he was also historically very anti-Trump, and then had sort of a flip and became very pro-Trump around 2020, 2021, when he ran for the Senate. But he did come from a very disadvantaged background. He struggled growing up. He came from a broken family and was able to build himself up to be this successful businessman, law school graduate from one of the best universities in the United States. Perhaps that can appeal to some voters. But what I've noticed, in fact, is that there are mixed reactions to this appointment. Some people do not view him as being anti-establishment enough, while others think he is a great choice, and they specifically look to some of his statements and policy ideas on the conflict in Ukraine. And we'll get into that shortly here, but those are just my introductory thoughts about who this man is. And I find his age in particular very interesting, as I said, against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
And I think his age has been a big issue in the sort of topic and discussion. And interestingly, if Trump were to be elected, and you know where my money is, if he were to be elected and then stepped aside during his presidency, then JD would be the youngest ever president. I think the youngest one before that was Teddy Roosevelt, who was 42 at the time. And the oldest, of course, was Joe Biden. What's your take, James?
Firstly, the name, Trump Vance. What a fantastic campaign name. Just like Advance, apart from Trump Vance. I think that's brilliant. Look, I think a lot of the pollsters, this election in the US later this year is going to be about the economy and immigration. And on the economy, a lot of the pollsters are saying it'll be won and lost in a handful of industrial Midwest battleground states and blue-collar swing states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And given his backstory and the fact that he comes from humble sort of blue-collar background, I think it's a very, very smart choice by Trump, actually, because, Bidenomics, which is supposed to be the bottom up and middle out sort of alternative, according to Biden, to Trump's top down. But it hasn't really worked because obviously inflation has really hit the US economy over the past few years, and people haven't felt that boost from so-called Bidenomics. So I think this is a smart move from Trump.
I think you're right. And if you look back at the 2016 campaign, and basically Trump chose Indiana Governor Mike Pence as the running mate, basically to appeal to the evangelical Christian voters, wasn't it, at that stage? Because Trump, by that stage, had already had a few marriages, and he thought that's the way to sway that particular electorate. But do you think, I want to go back to the comments that JD made about Trump, because people have always said Trump is not very forgiving. And we had comments being dug out by our David Lammy, the foreign secretary now, and what's going to happen there. But Trump seems to have forgiven him. What's your take on that, Taylor?
Yes, it is really interesting. Trump seems to be quite forgiving and very much willing to work with people who at one time had opposed him, which I think is a good quality to have in a leader, a political leader. But it does show that Trump, as I said, is quite trusting. So some of the things that J.D. Vance has said over the years before he flip-flopped on Trump was that he felt that Trump was somebody that the elites were correct about. He claimed to be a never Trump guy. He said, I never liked Trump. He can't stomach Trump. He thinks he's obnoxious and that he's leading the working class to a very dark place. So my question has been, and I think many others as well, is what caused him to flip-flop? And I think it's important to ask these questions, look at it objectively, and see if there's something there. Now, when I look at the state of Ohio and sort of the stats regarding the presidential election of 2016 and 2020, it's important to note that then candidate Donald Trump did win the state both times by a pretty significant majority, I would say. I think the second time around in 2020, it was somewhat close, about 500,000 votes between Joe Biden and Trump, with Trump being the victor in this. But I did wonder, perhaps, did J.D. Vance realize that pro-Trump candidates and candidates who are endorsed by Trump, they tend to do very well in the elections? If I look specifically at the stats here, let's look at the election year of 2020. This was around the